Well, welcome everyone. My name is Corby Hines, the Outings Guide with Sonoma Land Trust, and we are pleased to present tonight's installment of the Language of the Land series, the California Serengeti with Breck Parkman. Tonight we're going to be using Zoom's webinar platform, which means we cannot see your video or hear any of your voices out in the audience, but you still be able to interact with us via the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And for best viewing, we recommend setting your Zoom to speaker view during the presentation. We're going to reserve the last 20 minutes of tonight's presentation for the question and answer period. And you could submit your questions at the bottom, hitting that Q&A button, and we'll scroll through those, sort them out, and I'll ask those to Breck at that Q&A period. Presentation is scheduled till 8:30 p.m., and that includes the question and answer. We're also going to record tonight's presentation on Sonoma Land Trust's YouTube page in the next few days. So if you miss anything, or if you didn't take great notes, or if you want a friend to see this later, you're going to be able to do that. A little bit about Sonoma Land Trust if you're not familiar with us. We are a local nonprofit, and our mission is to protect the natural lands of Sonoma County for everyone's benefit. We were founded in 1976, and to date, we've protected over 50,000 acres right here in Sonoma County. And if you'd like to learn more, you can head to sonomalandtrust.org after the program. Now I'd like to introduce our guest. Breck Parkman was born and raised in Georgia, but has made California his home since 1971. Breck retired from state service in 2017 after 40 years as a state archaeologist. His work took him to all corners of the Golden State, as well as to Kodiak Island, Alaska, the Canadian Plains, the south coast of Peru, and central Siberia, among other places. Breck earned a BA and MA degrees in anthropology at California State University in Hayward. He was the founding director of the UNESCO-sponsored Fort Ross Global Village Project, and he's a former research associate at the University of California at Berkeley, and a past president of the Society for California Archaeology. Currently, Breck sits on the board of directors of two local nonprofits, the Sonoma Ecology Center and the Olompali People. Breck's research interests are broad and range from Ice Age megafauna to Russian America and the archaeology of the Grateful Dead. His work has been featured in several hundred newspaper, radio, and television interviews, and he's appeared in various films and documentaries that have aired on PBS, BBC, and the History and Discovery channels. Breck lives in Sonoma Valley with his teenage son. So we're very fortunate to have you today here with us, Breck. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good evening.
How you doing tonight?
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so happy there's people out there. I can't see everybody, but I know you're there, and thanks for tuning in. And I hope this is as much fun for you tonight, the audience, as it is for me to be presenting. Shall we start?
Let's jump right in. I'm excited about this.
I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint of slides, and let me do this. Let me do that. Just 1 minute while I set this up. Slideshow from the beginning. Go back, and there we go. I'm going to talk about the California Serengeti. Now, I grew up a long time ago reading National Geographic, and as a kid, I wanted to go to East Africa and work with the Leakeys, LSB and Mary Leakey. And of course, they were working at Olduvai Gorge in the Serengeti. So I grew up reading magazines that talked about the Serengeti, and I saw all the beautiful animals there. And I fell in love with the concept that somewhere in the world, we had something like the Serengeti. And in recent years, I've discovered that we had something like the Serengeti right here in our area in the North Bay, and in fact, all through Northern California. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. About 20 years ago, I was doing a survey, and I'll bet a lot of the audience has hiked on the Cordham Trail before. This photograph is looking at the Sonoma coast, and you can actually see the Cordham Trail running down the coastal terrace. I had to do a survey for state parks. I was working with a colleague and a friend of mine by the name of Raj Naidu, and we were looking at archaeology, but we were mostly looking for paleontological resources. So here we go. We're hiking, several miles on the coastal terrace, and Raj, the paleontologist, said, well, maybe we'll find some mammoth today. And we were looking at the interface between the A horizon and the C horizon, and I think you can see it in my graphic right there. We didn't find fossils of mammoths, but we did in fact find something just as good, or maybe better. And we found these rocks. The climbers call these rocks in the foreground sunset rocks, and I've often also called them mammoth rocks. We found a really unique polish on some of these rocks, and I'm going to show you here. Here's my friend Raj standing in front of one of the overhangs. And you can see some of the measurements there of where we found polish. At one time, this entire overhang was polished. And over the years, in recent years, lichen has begun to colonize the face of the rock, and it's slowly eating away the polish and covering it over. But there's still places you can see. And some of the areas go right up to the top here, 330 centimeters. Now, Raj and I looked at this, and we were intrigued with the polish. We'd both seen historic cattle. Here's a close-up of some of the polish also. We'd both seen cattle and other livestock polishing rocks. But the problem here is that the polish went up over 13 feet. So sitting and looking at this, we decided that we might possibly have ancient bison and ancient mammoth polish. Isn't this beautiful, this polish here? I started doing a lot of research, started writing a lot of articles, giving a lot of talks. This was a publication in Texas, the Mammoth Trumpet. And I kind of like this photo I took. I was down in Marin, and I pulled to the side of the road and watched a cow rubbing a rock. And I've seen that on ranches, and I've seen bison do that also. And the idea is that a lot of these large mega herbivores, like cows and horses, and small ones, even like sheep, will rub rocks for various reasons, partly because it feels really good, but it's also part of grooming behavior. And if you go to Africa today, you'll see African elephants doing the same thing. Rubbing rocks, rubbing termite mounds is part of their daily grooming. And I'll tell you how that works in just a second. I've worked up on the Canadian plains. And while working on the Canadian plains, I've seen a lot of buffalo rubbing rocks. And this is one right here that were used in the recent past, like early 1800s, and also in the ancient past, 10,000 years ago, by bison migrating through and grooming. And some of these bison rubbing rocks, or they call them buffalo rubbing rocks up there, actually have troughs that you can still see where they've been trod around and around and around. And they stand out. These are glacial erratics. The glaciers moved down south and then dropped when they retreated. And there's a number of, in fact, there's a number of regional parks in Canada called buffalo rubbing rock this and buffalo rubbing rock that. They're pretty common features up there. Buffalo still rub on rocks, and they do it because it feels good, and they do it also because it's part of the grooming behavior to get rid of ectoparasites. And here's one called into act here. Now, we haven't had bison in our area in a long time, and we've had domestic horses and cattle and sheep. In fact, where these rocks are, Sunset Rocks, there was a ranch there from the 1870s to the 1970s, and they had lots of cattle, horses, and sheep. And I have no doubt that those animals did some of the polishing on the rock, especially the rock polish below about 5 feet, which tends to be darker and fresher looking. But as you move up the rock up toward 13 feet, there's still plenty of polish, but it's duller. It hasn't been repolished. But in our area, we once had lots and lots of bison. In this painting here, you see bison as well as horses. They kind of look like zebras, but they're actually horses that we had here in North America during the last ice age. Now, I started talking about the mammoth rocks and at Sunset Rock. And a lot of people kind of, I think they were suspect that maybe I didn't know what I was talking about. And I talked to two of my friends, the late Steve Norwick and Dr. Rolf Erickson. Both were professors at Sonoma State at the time. And they were kind of skeptical, but they agreed to come out and look at the rock with me. And they came out and they were able to see what I saw. And it's not that I'm a visionary, but sometimes you have to see something with your own eyes. And what I saw was the selectivity of the polish. And that's what Steve and Roth saw also. So they began working with me. And by selectivity, the polish is in some areas of the rock and it's not in others. And the difference between where it's at and where it's not is part of the story that leads us to thinking that these are rubbing rocks. Anyway, with Steve and Roth's help, we started doing a lot of research. This is back about 2004. And Steve and Roth were able to get me access to the Sonoma State University physics lab, where we just happened to have a scanning electron microscope and an atomic force microscope with which to work. And here's Steve sitting at the computer with a scanning electron microscope with one of his assistants standing by. We had samples of the polish. I obtained samples of polish from other suspected polish sites. Once I started publishing and talking about this site, I found colleagues who had seen similar sites in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Wisconsin, and Nevada. And so I was able to obtain some small samples of the polish. I also had a friend who obtained polish for me from the Johannesburg Zoo, from an African elephant rubbing rock. And we started looking at the polish under magnification. Now, we knew that water can create rock polish, and we knew that wind will, and we knew that faulting would. And we also knew that elephants and livestock did. These are 4 micrographs taken of rock samples, including an elephant rubbing post. And we eliminated everything but the elephants. We ruled out faulting. We looked at some faulting polish under the scanning electron microscope. We looked at water polish and wind polish. And the only polish that we saw that had similarities were the elephant samples that were sent to me from Africa. And without getting into all the details, one of the things I see here is I see these Z-shaped scratches. And what those are, when an elephant rubs in mud or wallows in dust and then rubs it off on a rock, they leave little scratches from the grit on their hide. And as they make contact with the rock and they move back and forth, they're actually making these little nested Z's. And that's what we're seeing here. We also used the atomic force microscope, and what we saw here was an extremely planar surface in all our samples. In other words, it had been rubbed down really, really smooth. And you see that in the photos of the actual, the rocks themselves. Now, elephants rub rocks, and that's a pretty known fact. I've talked to zoologists from Africa and observers, they do. And they do it because it feels good. But one of the main reasons elephants rub rocks, and we assume the same for the mammoths, is that elephants don't have a lot of hair, nor did our Columbian mammoths. And to get rid of ectoparasites, you have to rub them off. So what they did, and what they still do, is they'll get nice and muddy, and then they let the mud dry. And just before the mud is really, really hard, they'll go over to a telephone pole or a termite mound, or preferably a boulder if there's a rock nearby, and they rub the mud off. And by doing so, they're getting rid of all the ectoparasites, ticks, fleas, flies, anything that's punishing their skin. Now, when I was a kid, I had a rock tumbler. And some of you may have had rock tumblers and may still have one. And if you recall, you want to polish rocks that start out being angular and not very smooth, and the final product is going to be a smooth, nice, rounded rock. And you do it using different types of grits and polishes. That's essentially what the elephants are doing to the rocks today, and that's what the mammoths were doing. They're leaning against the rock with clay-encrusted hide with sand grit, and they're rubbing and rubbing and rubbing, and they're polishing the rock, but they're constantly making little scratches too, because there's always going to be some sand grit on your muddy hide. So that's what we're seeing there. So it's like a large rock tumbler. And I say large for a reason. So here's a Columbian mammoth, just for comparison. A really, really large Columbian mammoth could stand as much as 13 feet at the shoulder. And they could weigh up to 20,000 pounds. Now, the average was just a little bit smaller than that, maybe 11, 12 feet at the shoulder, maybe 16,000 pounds. But a really large one would look something like this. So imagine this mammoth caked in mud that's almost dry, rubbing against a rock over and over. and then another one in line, another one in line, and doing this generationally for thousands of years. You would get really highly polished rock like we see on the coast in other places around North America. Now, here's the Mammoth rock site again, which climbers call Sunset Rocks. And this is one of my favorite exposures of the rock here. It's a little apex, a vertical apex where the rock comes together. And right on the edge there, the polish goes up 396 centimeters from the surface right up. And it's just on the edge, a couple inches on either side of the edge of the rock where my friend Kate is pointing here. That must have been a really, really good place to polish because that rock is really hard, and yet it's been planed down smooth along the edge. I don't know how many generations of mammoths would be required to do that. And I say mammoths because although bison were rubbing rocks too, and quite likely visited the site, the higher polish, the older polish, I'm pretty sure must be mammoth. Now, what does that mean? I wanted to get some facts. Being a scientist, and also a storyteller, I can tell stories, but I would like to tell more accurate stories by doing science. So one of the things I did is I went to one of the polished rocks that we had found. Here's another one here that we call Jasper Rock. It's a couple of miles away from Sunset Rocks. And we did a several-year excavation project with Santa Rosa Junior College and the professor, Tom Orger. With the class, we excavated a number of units, including this large control pit. They ended up going down over 3 meters. And we were looking for any signs of presence of mammoths. And, I was hoping to find broken tusk and mammoth hair. We didn't find that. We actually found that it was a quarry in the prehistoric past. And so we kind of changed our plans. But here's what the polish looks like at that site, the Jasper Rock site. It's a red chert or jasper. And look how beautiful and smooth this polish is here. It's incredible. And that's probably why the reason people over time, especially 9,000 years ago, chose it to quarry, to get pieces to take back to turn into tools. This is Jasper Rock also. We wanted to look at the geomorphology and how the soil had built up here. And you see the master pit here when we pulled the shoring out to close it down, going down and down and down. I didn't find mammoth tusk, but I did find that the polish went 2 meters below the surface before it stopped, which means that the ground had been building up from thousands of years ago. So I was trying to figure out what could I do. So in this massive excavation, I kept every water-worn pebble that was found. And these are not artifacts, they're just natural water-worn pebbles. But I wanted to look for broken rocks. And we have things called geofacts, which are rocks broken by nature, kind of look like tools. And we have artifacts, rocks that are broken by humans to make into tools. And then we have zoofacts. And zoofacts are rocks that are broken by large animals that resemble tools. And I was looking for zoofacts because I thought if I find zoofacts, I'll find evidence of heavy trampling by animals. So level after level, unit after unit, all the pebbles were saved, and I went through and analyzed them. So here's just a regular unit, North 3, West 11. This is 110 to 120 centimeters, which we dated at 9,000 years ago, looking at some of the pebbles. And then we dropped down to 20,000 years ago, based on a beta radiocarbon date, and there's more pebbles from a unit. I got down to 290 to 300 centimeters, which is, that's about 10 feet down. And that's where the ratio of broken pebbles went way high. Now, I don't know that that means that mammoths were trampling that area at that time, but I suspect they were. And so anyway, that's just part of the story. But imagine me every night sitting up counting hundreds and not thousands of pebbles and segregating them. I did that for about 2 years. The more I did there, the more I worked on these sites, the word got out and there was more and more interest. And my old friend Huell Hauser, who I worked with quite a bit on California's Gold, called me and talked me into doing a show. So he came up and we filmed one of his shows at Sunset Rocks. So here we are. He had such a good time that day. He'd wanted to do something about mammoths, he said, for years. So in this 30-minute program, the first half is down at La Brea Tar Pits, and the second half is at Sonoma Coast. And you can actually go online. If you go to the Chapman University Huell Hauser archives, when Huell passed away a few years ago, he left all of his shows to the university, and they're all accessible for free online. So you can go down and watch any show you want that he ever did. It was an amazing gift. And you can find the Mammoth show if you're interested in it. And then there were a lot of other shows. I did something for PBS, KQED's Quest on the site also. And it's one of my favorites. It turned out real well. This is just a still from it. That's also viewable on YouTube if you go in and find Quest on that. And then finally, here's one of my favorites. The BBC came over, and they wanted to do a film here as part of a 3-part documentary they were doing, or a miniseries called Ice Age Giants. So here's the crew up on one of the rocks filming, and that's Dr. Alice Roberts, who's a very well-known British broadcaster. She's an archaeologist. She's also a medical doctor, and has done some really dynamic programs, some of which you might have seen or heard of. And to the far right is my friend Mags Lightbody. Mags was the producer. And while sitting talking about the rock, I told Mags, I said, my desire is to someday make a time machine and go back and catch a mammoth rubbing against this rock. And she said, I can do that. And I said, you can make a time machine? She said, no, but I can make a mammoth and I'll have it rubbing the rock. And that's just what she did. Here's a still from the miniseries. And using computer graphics, she made a mammoth. And while we're viewing these rocks, this mammoth walks up and starts to rub the rock. And I'd still like to make a time machine and go back and see it for myself, but this was the next best thing. It was pretty cool. Speaking of time machines, everybody has their idea of how do you go back in time. And I thought about creating a time machine for the night, and I actually built one, but I'm too scared to try it out because I don't want to get halfway back and not be able to get everyone home. So I'm going to do something different. We're going to use story and what we're doing right now, just interpretation, to take you back in time. So here we are on the Cordon Trail again, and we're looking up the coast, and you can see the big rock, and behind it is Sunset Rocks or Mammoth Rock. And I would ask you to try to imagine what our area was like 18,000 years ago. Now, 18,000 years ago wasn't that long ago. It seems like it, but it wasn't really that long ago. But what's interesting about that time is it was the last glacial maximum. So it was the last furthest advance of the glaciers before the world started warming and the glaciers started melting and they retreated and the ocean came up. Because 18,000 years ago, the ocean out there was 400 feet lower than it is today. Imagine that. So by story and by visuals, we'll take the place of a time machine and we'll go back if everybody's ready. So here we go. So we're going to go back 18,000 years and see what the Sonoma Coast and also the Petaluma Valley, the Santa Rosa Plains, and all these places look like. So here we go. Okay, that's the wrong slide. I'm sorry. This is, let me try this again. I have a filter on here. That's better. Now that's what we're going to see. Not that the other wasn't fun. Ice Age is one of my favorite movies, but this is the real Ice Age. This is what we want to look at today. What do you see out there? Well, I see bison. I see short-faced bear. I see a saber-toothed cat and a couple of mammoth and a large condor. You would have seen all of those out there 18,000 years ago. You would have seen them in Petaluma, Novato, San Francisco, all through our area. And you would have seen them in pretty great numbers. Maybe not so many saber-tooths, but you would have seen a lot of bison and quite a few mammoth. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Going back to the Serengeti Plains, I grew up wanting to go to the Serengeti. I wanted to be surrounded by animals like this and be able to see them. Now, in recent years, I've read about the Serengeti, and I've read that paleontologists say that the historic Serengeti was one of the greatest sites in the world for wildlife. But they say that the paleontological Serengeti, in other words, the fossil Serengeti from 20,000 years ago, was even greater. The diversity and numbers of animals were even greater 18,000 years ago than they were 100 years ago. And 100 years ago, there were a lot. And I've also read that what we had here in Northern California and Central California was every bit as great as the Serengeti had ever been. We had something that equaled it or perhaps even surpassed it right here. And it's hard to imagine that. Here's kind of a fuzzy little still from one of the documentaries I was in, but just to give you an idea of what this looked like with the herds of grazing animals trailed by predators. You've got browsers out there, browsers up in the hills. It was a mosaic of wildlife, and it was absolutely beautiful. Trying to think now, so we're 18,000 years ago, and trying to imagine the sounds and the smells. Well, the waterfowl and the bird song, I think, would have been deafening in certain areas at certain times. I can't imagine. It would have been deafening just 150 years ago. You know, if you think about waterfowl on San Francisco Bay, it wasn't that long ago that the skies would darken with waterfowl. And the sounds would just pierce your ears. There were so many. And songbirds too. I can remember as a kid camping as a young child. And the songbirds, there were so many more than we have now. And if we went back 18,000 years ago, I cannot imagine what it sounded like. I also can't imagine what it smelled like. All of those animals out there probably smelled kind of like going down the freeway and going by some of these feedlots in the Central Valley. Maybe not quite that bad, but there definitely would have been a smell. And you'd have also had struggling animals and dying animals and dead animals. And for that reason, we would have had a lot of vultures here and a lot of condors. It would have been something to see, but it would have been a complete ecosystem that was existing for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. A little something I did called Seeing the Mammoth. The more I started studying this, the more I started really beginning to understand mammoths. And a Colombian mammoth probably consumed 500 to 750 pounds of food a day. And that was primarily grasses and sedges in our area, because in our area, we had grasses and sedges, and that was a preferred food for mammoths. Now, that's a day. So if you're taking in 500 to 750 pounds of food, you're creating a lot of dung, at least 300 to 500 pounds a day. So I'm picturing a herd of mammoth numbering probably 7 to 20 animals, similar to African elephant herds, creating upwards of 500 pounds of dung a day per elephant, per mammoth. And that's a lot of dung. Imagine that. What does that mean? Well, the Colombian mammoth was a hindgut feeder. We know that, which makes them similar to like modern day horses. They had to eat more food than they processed. They processed about half of what they ate. Here's some mammoth dung from the Colorado Plateau, found in a dry cave. And you can see that half of this looks to be unprocessed, which means it's filled with grasses, seeds, and sedges, completely not processed. Here's another photo of another piece of elephant dung, or in this case, mammoth dung. And you can see the unprocessed materials here as well. So think about that. You've got elephants traipsing across the landscape, creating a lot of dung. Now, traipsing, here's elephants walking single file. The one thing I found out from people working in Africa is a lot of the historic roads in Africa were once elephant roads. And they were so well developed that early people just continued using them. And then later engineers incorporated them into new highway systems. I suspect the same thing is here. I drive Highway 1 from Bodega Head up to north of Salt Point. And I know that's an ethnographic Native American trail. And it makes me think that it's probably under the trail is probably an ancient mammoth road for the very same reasons. It runs along the ecotone at the back of the coastal terrace. And it's either on top of or very close to a mammoth trail that allowed animals to go up and down the coastal terrace. I drive Highway 12 through the Valley of the Moon from Sonoma to Santa Rosa, and I see the same thing. Mammoths made their way through the Valley of the Moon. And there are areas where they snake through some pretty, it's not too wide there. And you know that Highway 1's on top of a mammoth trail, a mammoth highway. So next time you drive Highway 1 or Highway 12, think about that you're actually traversing a road that might be a lot older than anyone thought. Just an idea. And in addition to the mammoth, a lot of the other animals would have used the same roads for the same reason. This is from the Serengeti again. Father Crespi was a member of the Fages Crespi expedition of 1772 a Spanish expedition that came to San Francisco Bay. And in Father Crespi's diary, he noted that they kept walking on these well-defined Indian roads on the eastern side of San Francisco Bay. Native people, indigenous people, had highways themselves. Now, they weren't paved, but they were hardpacks. And quite likely, some of those indigenous highways were also ancient mammoth trails. Interesting to think about. Now, another way to think about this landscape that we're seeing at 18,000 years ago is we've got carnivores and we got herbivores, or predators and prey. So there are animals that eat plants, and there's animals that eat animals that eat plants. And here we go. Here's sort of an artistic depiction of what our Serengeti might have looked like, minus the snowy mountains and minus the muskox. As far as I know, we didn't have muskox here, but I think we had everything else you see in this photo or in this painting here. And just look at that for a minute. We had the Western horse here. In fact, this is where the horse originated in the world and then moved over to Asia from North America. I see a short-faced bear or two. I see wolves. I see mammoth. I think we're looking at woolly mammoths in this painting, and we would have had Columbian mammoths. Woolly mammoths were further inland where it was colder. California was a refuge, actually. It was a climate refuge, and it wasn't quite as severe here as it was just inland over the Sierras. So, a lot of animals hung out here and enjoyed it and didn't want to go anywhere else, just like people today. Now, talking about going anywhere else, here is the San Francisco Bay. And I can't drive over to Golden Gate Bridge anymore without seeing the California River and the Franciscan Valley and the Farallon Plain. Now, the California River is a name that was given to this area by a scientist in the 50s. And it's the combined Sacramento and San Joaquin River system, which are now submerged. They're what's called Raccoon Strait on the north side of Angel Island is part of the old river during the Pleistocene time. And that's why there's a strong current there. But before the Ice Age ended and the water came up 400 feet, San Francisco was a big valley, and it was drained by the California River. Scientists have also called that valley the Franciscan Valley. It's now submerged under the bay. And then out here the other direction, you have the Farallon Plain, which is a name I came up with years ago in some of my publications, which was a broad coastal terrace, completely dry 18,000 years ago. And it connects with the Franciscan Valley here. I started imagining these migrations, just like the Serengeti. And if you add the Central Valley to the Franciscan Valley, you have this immense interior pasture. And if you look at the Farallon Plain, which is the lighter blue here, you have an immense pasture out on the coast. And we're talking about just the Farallon Plain and the Franciscan Valley, upwards of 3 to 4 million acres here, with a number of ways to get out and get back. Why would an animal go out to the Farallon Plain? Well, we had a Mediterranean climate 18,000 years ago, just like we do today. So the weather was pretty similar, other than a little extremes. But the grasses were different. A lot of the grasses we see today are exotics. The grasses were more bunch grasses, and they were all native grasses then. And they didn't turn yellow like a lot of our grasses do today in summer, but they still kind of got a little dry in the summer when it was hot. But out on the coast, because of fog, the grass stayed lush. And there was a reason to go to the coast in summer, late spring, summer, early fall, and then go back in winter when the grasses were getting more lush in the interior. So it sets into this motion, this east-west migration, kind of similar to what we see in the Serengeti. And so this is one of them. Here's the California River. It was a perfect way to move from the interior out to the coastal terrace by way of what's now called the Golden Gate. I don't know what the Mammoth called it. They probably had a different word for it to get to the Farallons. You could have actually walked out to the Farallons from San Francisco 18,000 years ago, as hard as that is to believe. Here's one for the folks in Petaluma Valley. This is the Petaluma-Bodega migration corridor, linking the interior pastures with the coastal pastures by way of places like Estero Americana, Estero San Antonio, Americana Creek, and Stemple Creek, and Santonio Creek. If you look at those drainages, they create a corridor that allows east-west movement. And then the next one is the Russian River. Russian River was another migration route getting out to the coast, and that's where the Mammoth rocks come in. Now, what I've done over the years is I've looked at all the locations I can find in the records of where Rancho La Brea late Ice Age fossils have been found: mammoth, horse, camel, saber-toothed cat, mastodon, where they've been found. And I'm finding that, yeah, out in Petaluma Valley, out on the Santa Rosa Plain, there's lots and lots of fossils. But they also occur only in these corridors in areas that are hard to explain unless animals are migrating, which I think they are. Here we go. Here's Mammoth Rocks down here. Here's the Highway 1 pass. Imagine a herd of mammoth coming down the Russian River, which would have been a little drier at the time. And there's a pass there that the ethnographic Native American Trail passed over, that today Highway 1 passes over, right at Bridgehaven. And quite likely the mammoth climbed out of the river basin at that point also to get over to the coastal terrace. And then you have these rugged rocks right at the base of that pass out of the coastal terrace. Probably all goes together there. The California grizzly. So the California grizzly is our state animal. It was last seen in California in 1922 when one was killed near Yosemite, the last one. And then, 31 years later, people say, oh, it's beautiful, let's make it the state animal. It's kind of funny how it works that way. But the California grizzly originally was Ursus horribilis, terrible bear. Someone met the bear and said it was terrible. Could weigh over 1,500 pounds, a really large one. And if you were unfortunate to have one stand up in front of you, it could be 8 feet tall. Now that's a big bear. And it's kind of scary, but a beautiful thought about also. But here's one we had 18,000 years ago. So in our trip back to the past, which we're all on right now, this is the one animal you got to keep your eyes open for. This is the giant short-faced bear. On its hind legs, it stood 10 foot tall. When it was on all fours, it was about 5 foot tall at the shoulder. Weighed over 1,500 pounds and could run, some scientists think it could run more than 50 miles an hour. Now, a California grizzly was not quite as tall, but just as heavy, and it was more muscled, a California grizzly. California grizzly could probably run about 35 miles an hour, which means it could outrun any of us in the room tonight, and it could outrun any racehorse known. 35 miles per hour is fast. But think about 50 miles an hour, just that difference. It couldn't outrun a cheetah, but it could outrun anything out on that Serengeti plain. So this bear, which was the largest carnivorous mammal ever to live on North American continent, could essentially eat anything it wanted to eat. And it did. Here's a little artist drawing of the size of the short-faced bear. Imagine seeing this out there and surviving. People were probably here 18,000 years ago. We haven't found sites that stand up to scrutiny yet in this area that are that old. 13,000 years, yes. 18,000, but I have a feeling they're out there. People 15,000 years ago, even 12,000 years ago, when I know there were people living in our area, lived with these bears, and they survived and they flourished because they were smart. They had knowledge. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here's a short-faced bear standing down a saber-toothed cat. Would have been no contest, but it looks like in this painting, the cat's trying to stand its ground. Saber-tooth would have been pretty awesome to see. I can't imagine. But we had them right here. And then here's one probably a lot of people don't know about. The big guy in the back is an American lion, standing beside a modern-day African lion. The American lion is now extinct. It's been extinct since about 11,000 years ago, but it was larger than a full-grown male lion today. Big, beautiful creature, probably hunted in prides. And then bison. Look at these two bison. We had 2 bison in our area, Sonoma County. This really big guy went extinct 25,000 years ago with those long, 3-foot-long saber horns, 8 feet tall at the shoulder. And the smaller guy, if you can call this buffalo or bison small, 7 foot at the shoulder, was one of the last animals to go extinct, probably around 11,000 years ago. Maybe we'll discover someday a little later than that. But they were here. Here's the big guy, though, again, just to give you an idea of size. I think that's impressive. I don't think now this is a grazer. It's not a predator or carnivore, but I sure wouldn't want to run into this one. I can't imagine. But again, people were living, well, maybe not 25,000 years ago, but the slightly smaller variant, Bison antiquus, people lived with. And we had Western horses. Again, the horse originated in our area, as did the camel. There's the Western camel. And Harlan's ground sloth. I found a ground sloth years ago up in the Lake Oroville area, and I thought it was a whale. It was disarticulated and the bones had separated a little bit and it was spread out, but it was so big that I thought it was a small whale from like the Miocene or something. And it was a late Ice Age ground sloth. Amazing creatures. So we had the mammoth and we had the mastodon. Now this is a woolly mammoth. It's not a Columbian mammoth on the left. The mastodon was slightly smaller, maybe stood 8 to 10 feet, weighed about 8,000, 12,000 pounds. And it was a browser, and that's important because if we're out on the Sonoma Coast today, we're probably not going to see a mastodon. If we hike up into the hills, or if we go up in the hills overlooking Petaluma Valley, or get into the forest, we're probably going to see the mastodons. But we're going to see mammoths out on the plains for sure. Here's a comparison. Again, we have the Columbian mammoths, which aren't hairless, but they're almost hairless. I have a friend that excavated a mammoth a few years ago down near Monterey, and they actually found mammoth hair from a Columbian mammoth, and it was red of all things. You know, we've never really thought much about what color the hair was. And in the case of this mammoth, it had red hair, which I think is kind of cool. Now, this is just from one of my reports, and I just show it really quickly to remind myself. But I tried to do an estimate, and I used the animal estimates from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge or Reserve, and I used the Serengeti, and I used the historic North American plains to try to figure out how many animals our area might have sustained 18,000 years ago. And these are just some of the numbers I played with. But the mammoth, I came up with 725, and that would be from San Benito in the south all the way up to Cloverdale. And I think those numbers might be a little high, but I figured we had about 225 in the North Bay and maybe 500 in the South Bay. And the numbers might just be a little bit high, but just gives you an idea. But the bison, I'm figuring 227,000 in Central California. And for all I know, it could have been more than that. If anyone wants to dispute this, I would love it. And all I say is prove me wrong. Go out and let's figure out how many animals our landscape would have, sustained 18,000 years ago. And I think the numbers would have been huge. Now, as people were coming to North America from Asia or wherever, we had animals coming also a little earlier. And we had also animals going back, leaving. So we had camels and horses here that ended up going over to Asia. And eventually we had bison and mammoths coming to North America from that part of the world. So we had migrations going back and forth, just something to keep in mind. Now to talk a little bit about our environment, what are we seeing? If we went back a little bit earlier, I think we would see forests that included Sitka spruce at Bodega Head. Here is a 48,000-year-old Sitka spruce tree. My friends and I excavated, salvaged at Bodega Head years ago, washing out in the storm. And that blue clay you see is an Ice Age deposit. And in it is this large tree. You can see sort of the base of it. We recovered 33 Sitka spruce cones, all of which now are in Berkeley at the Museum of Paleontology. And today, to see a Sitka spruce tree, you have to go up to Mendocino County, the very northern part, and there's an island of Sitka spruce, an island on the map. There's a small area of Sitka spruce, and then you have to go hundreds of miles further north to see the stand, where they really start growing. We don't have Sitka spruce down here, but we did 48,000 years ago. And that's kind of cool. Now, some of you will remember the New Year's Eve flood, 2005, 2006. As part of my job, I went out and for 6 weeks, I walked all the creeks and rivers and to see what had been washed out, what was known and what wasn't known, what could be discovered. And this is Sonoma Creek up at Sugarloaf Ridge State Park, and I'm out surveying. And I found another site with this blue clay. And I realized the blue clay was probably an Ice Age deposit. Turns out it was. It was filled with little pieces of wood, carbonizing wood. Here's some of it that I salvaged. Multiple species, but what was really interesting is I pulled 6 pine cones out of this deposit, the little bit that I salvaged, and they're mostly Monterey pine. There's 2 pines that might be hybrids, but they're Monterey pine. And I've radiocarbon dated the deposit, and the upper part of it is 18,000 years old, and the lower part is 27,000 years old. And the pine cones seem to be coming from the lower part, but it's last glacial maximum. Just like some of the pine trees today have problems with pine beetle infestation, some of these cones also show signs of beetle damage. You can see it in this photo here on the right. Today, to see a Monterey pine forest, you've got to go down the Monterey Peninsula, and you'll see pine forests there and some places further south. But we don't have native pines growing today. In fact, I think a lot of us consider the Monterey pine an exotic today, and yet it really isn't. It just disappeared for a while and eventually may come back in another ice age. So here's that site again on Sonoma Creek, and you can see where the two dates came from, 18,000, 27,000 years ago, and the cones. And I didn't find any bison remains or short-faced bear remains or mammoth remains. I was hoping to find something. I only salvaged a very small part of the site of this deposit that was caving in during the flood, but I found the pine cones, and that gives me a lot to think about, a lot to talk about today. And we probably all know what this is. This is one of California's precious vernal pools. I forget where this one is, somewhere in Central California, maybe San Diego. But it's a vernal pool. Here's a map showing the distribution of vernal pools in the Central Valley. And the Central Valley has many, many of them. Fairfield, Vacaville area, we have some of the most beautiful. And we actually have them out on the Santa Rosa Plain as well, vernal pools. They're incredible environments. If you've ever gone out and looked at the plants and the insects around them, they're incredible. And they're very protected and almost sacred to us. They fill up with rainwater during the winter, and then they hold that rainwater for a long time until the land heats up in summer, and it eventually evaporates. And the reason they hold the water is that there's a hard pan beneath the surface of these little pools, and the water doesn't necessarily percolate through. And there's at least 5 types of vernal pools in California that I'm aware of. And one of the types I think might actually be relic mammoth wallows. Now, that sounds kind of weird, but here's a buffalo wallow in Kansas in 1897. It was still out there. It's probably 100 years old, maybe 1,000 years old. Our landscape, with all these mammoth and all these bison that I've been describing, would have had incredible amounts of wallows. It would have been a wallowed landscape. It just makes sense. Now, normally I would have thought that the wallows would have disappeared over the last 10,000 years, and probably many of them did. So you imagine 10,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago, as a lot of these animals start going extinct, there's going to be less and less wallows out there. But I think some survived. And the reason some of them survived is these wallows have a hard pan under them from the pressure and the weight of the mammoths and the bison. And the reason I know that is because on the Great Plains, if you read the early accounts of the Great Plains, there were buffalo wallows all over, and they held rainwater. And that's where a lot of people would go to get water for their horses or for themselves early on. They held water, and it was a vibrant part of the plains ecosystem, these old buffalo wallows. The clay creates an impermeable floor under them, and that collects the water, then it slowly evaporates, as the world warms up. I can think of 2 vernal pools in the San Joaquin Valley that had been trenched years ago for whatever reason, and they both had megafauna remains in the base of them. Under that hard pan, they had bison and I think mammoth bones, fossil bones, in the vernal pool. And that's kind of telling in my mind. Here's a painting, here's a Remington's painting, Fight for the Water Hole. And this is a bison wallow that's been enlarged and still has water in this famous painting by Remington. Here's a contemporary photo from Africa. And you see the water holes here, which quite likely are elephant wallows that have a hard pan at the base from all the weight that are holding water. There's also a place where the elephant can get in, get muddy, and then rub the ectoparasites off. So here's one of our beautiful, beautiful vernal pools. And I see that and I kind of wonder, what is it beyond just being a vernal pool? Is it a wallow? Now, the wallows would have been everywhere, and not all the wallows survived. But why wouldn't some wallows survive? They've got a hard pan. They fill with water. Every few years, mammoths or bison come back and rub them out. But as the animals start going extinct, animals use the wallows less and less. And the plants have learned to adapt. The plants come in, and every few years, maybe the mammoth come back, and they wallow them out. The plants come back, and they get wallowed out. And this goes on for thousands of years, and it's making the plants hardy. And then eventually, someday, the mammoths don't come back, and the plants have the vernal pools to themselves. I think that's a real possibility. I've talked to some friends of mine, and we need some botanists to look at it a little more. It may not be the case, but I just can't imagine, where did the vernal pools all go? Did they all infill? And I don't think so. So I would pose the question, how many of our mammoth wallows later became vernal pools? I talked to, I've read the studies of Dr. Robert Harlan, and Dr. Harlan was the vernal pool, the father of vernal pools in California. He was a biologist, botanist, and he wrote about vernal pools. And in one of his books, he said, the smallest vernal pool I ever saw was about 5 inches in diameter. And he went on to tell the story, and it was a bedrock mortar, a Native American grinding stone in bedrock, a very shallow cavity that had become a vernal pool. Dirt had blown in, it held rainwater, and plants had adapted to it. And he said the strangest looking one was about 100 feet long, about 8 feet or 8 inches wide, and it was over in Fairfield. And he said what happened is a truck came into the preserve in late spring, right after a rain, and kind of got off the road and drug one of its tires about 100 feet, got stuck, tried to get out. And right after that, summer came and it heated up, and that trough got really hard. And then the next year it filled for water. And then the next year it filled with rainwater, and the plants moved in. And what he saw was this long, skinny vernal pool. So back in, years ago, after the Vietnam War, I was taking a flight from Bangkok to Tokyo, and I flew over the Plain of Jars in Laos. And I'd always, as an archaeologist, wanted to see the Plain of Jars. It's an incredible archaeological area. And the plane left Bangkok early in the morning. It was a clear day. It had rained a couple days before. And as we moved across the Plain of Jars, I started seeing something below, and I couldn't see the stone jars that make the plain famous for archaeologists, these large bedrock vessels carved out of native stone. But I saw something even better. I saw a string of pearls, and it went as far as I could see, probably 80 miles I could see, these sparkling, beautiful pearls. And I was trying to figure, what am I seeing? And this is early morning. And then it dawned on me, I'm seeing the Ho Chi Minh Trail from the Vietnam War, which had been bombed into oblivion just a few years earlier. We dropped more bombs on that part of the world than in all of World War II. And what I was seeing in the early morning light were bomb craters from up, 4 or 5 miles high. And it was the sun reflecting on the water, the rainwater in these bomb craters. And I became fascinated that, so I started reading more about it and how the Laotian people, they raise fish in these bomb craters, and they raise plants, and they've made use of the bomb craters. It's become part of the environment, whether they wanted it to or not. And it's like, if bomb craters can become vernal pools, and bedrock mortars and tire tracks can become vernal pools, why can't a mammoth wallow become a vernal pool? And the only question is, could it survive 10,000 years? And I think the plants are an answer to that. Plants and the hard pan. The hardiness of the plants have maintained the pool over these years. And I'd love for someone to maybe take a look at that. But another project. So going back to this first photo I showed, here's Sunset Rocks, or Mammoth Rocks, Locust 1. Locust 2 is that really big rock. This is a telephoto, so it's compressed. And then Locust 3 is a smaller rock that has some polish on it. And to be honest, I've found, I think, 16 boulders within 2 miles that are polished, but none are as spectacular as this Locust 1. That's where a lot of the polish is. But look at that green depression there. Now, it's kind of contorted from the telephoto, but that's about a 2-acre horseshoe-shaped depression attached to a drainage. And I've gone out and looked at that. And it's like, well, if I'm right about the polish being from muddy mammoths rubbing, there's got to be a wallow, and it's probably gone, but what if it's still there? And I started looking at this. So I've been out with a couple of podologists from Berkeley who study ancient soils, and we've cored it. And we've gotten down, this is years ago, but we got down to like 2 meters or 6 or 7 feet. And it's the most beautiful black clay I've ever seen. So it's an old deposit, and quite likely that might be one of our, not necessarily a vernal pool, but one of our relic wallows. And I would sure like to think that. So here's California grasses. What can we learn from the animals? And people will say we can learn from the animals, and I really believe that. Here's our California grasses, very different than the non-native grasses that we have today. There's actually a war going on. There was a war of conquest in California fought in the 1800s as first Spanish and then Russian and then American gold miners and settlers came in and wanted to take the land from indigenous people. And there was a lot of conflict, there was a lot of sadness, and it still goes on. But it was a hard time for Native people. That war of conquest continues today, and it's being fought also at the plant level. And you can go out into a nice meadow and look at the native grasses and look at the exotic grasses. And if you listen, you can almost hear bugles and sabers and war cries and sorrowful cries as the plants battle. And some plants who've come here in the last 150 years are trying to take over. And in some areas, they've done a really good job of it. This is Stephen Edwards. Steve is one of my friends and certainly one of my mentors. And he was the head of the botanical gardens at Tilden Park for years. And he's an amazing, amazing individual. But he's looked at paleobotany and paleontology in our area, and he shaped a lot of my ideas. And in some of our conversations, he talks about bunch grass. And why do you think bunch grass bunches? And he talks about tarweed, and why is tarweed sticky and hard to eat? And he talks about the possibility that we're seeing a California flora shaped by 70 million years of mammal grazing. That the flora is actually a product, an artifact, or a beautiful feature of this interrelationship between fauna and flora in California. And the tarweed has developed this very sticky turpentine-like taste, and the bunch grasses grow in bunches, partly so they don't get destroyed by heavy-footed bison. A bison hoof not only is heavy, but it's sharp, and the bison aerate the soil. There's that famous scene from Dances with Wolves when Kevin Costner and his friends crawl up and they look over and they see this denuded area on the plains where a large herd of bison have just passed by, and they've kicked up, I think, the short grasses. Well, bunch grasses would be harder to do that too. And, the bison can still graze them, but something survives. And Steve wonders if that's why we have bunch grasses out here evolving. And then a final thought, because my time's running out, but my final thought here are some of these animals are area's first landscape architects. Now, I know a number of landscape architects, and I think at least one of them is tuning in tonight. But think about this. The mammoth preferred grass and sedge as food, and were available, that's what they ate, and it was available here. So you have the herds of mammoths selecting grass and sedge. Now, they're only processing about half of what they eat. So they're pooping out a lot of dung that includes a lot of unprocessed grass and sedge seed and leaves and all. The bison are right there with the mammoth, and they're aerating or rototilling the soil, turning it over, and the mammoth are pooping on that. And the bison dung and urine are very fertile. They're like fertilizers. So over time, over thousands of years, I can picture the Farallon Plain and the Santa Rosa Plain and the Petaluma Valley and the Franciscan Valley becoming these really lush pastures with beautiful soils and beautiful vegetation, just like we're hoping to see today. I know I have some regenerative grazers and agricultural people tuning in tonight too, and they're talking about the depletion of our soils and how we need to work on that. And we really do, and I think we can learn from the mammoth and the bison quite possibly. We saw Pleistocene extinctions. I think I got 1 minute here, so let me just make a point. Pleistocene extinction, a lot of the animals I talked about are gone now. And one of the early theories is that we overhunted, people overhunted. And another theory was climate change, which is certainly an important one. And then in more recent years, people thought, well, maybe a disease also went through the herds of animals. Today, we're seeing another extinction event, and it's going faster and faster. And it's partly industrialization and overdevelopment, which is kind of like overhunting. It's partly a global pandemic, that's affecting us and maybe eventually wildlife, and certainly climate change. So there's a lot going on, and environmental collapse isn't our future unless we do something about it. And I think we really need to do something about it. Groups like the Sonoma Land Trust are doing something about it. The Sonoma Ecology Center, which I'm associated with, and open space and the parks, they're preserving biodiversity and habitat, and they're preserving public lands for us all at the same time. And that's an all over good. So I think it's time for some questions. So we're going to get back in this time machine. And there we go. I think it's time for questions. So I'm going to
Thanks, Breck, for
stop my share, and there we are.
Well, for somebody like me who's fascinated with the Ice Age, that was very satisfying. It was just amazing to think about all those creatures and that incredible diversity. And there was people there 12,000 years ago to see that, and that maybe the roads we're driving on are ancient mammoth highways, and that vernal pools are these wallows. It's just such it's just a great thing. And
everybody think about it when they drive from now. Think about these roads and what you're seeing. We can still learn from the past.
Yeah, and we do have questions pouring in. So for those of you out there that have some questions, use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen there and type them in, and I'll go ahead and ask those to Breck. But before we do that, I just want to, for those that can't stay, I want to thank you so much for attending. And if you would like to keep engaged with the Land Trust by following our various social media accounts, please visit our website, check out our Facebook and our Instagram. And if you want to see this presentation, it's going to be up on our website at sonomalandtrust.org/nature@home. So this will be for your reference there, or if you've got friends that want to check it out, please send them that way. And keep an eye out for future webinars. We've got another one coming up on January 28th, and that's going to be on mushrooms and medicinal herbs. So if you're interested in that, you can go to sonomalandtrust.org/outings and sign up for that one. And also keep in mind that we are a local nonprofit, which means that we rely on donations from individuals and businesses and foundations to make our work possible. So if you love the land like us, please consider donating, because your gift helps support land protection and preservation. And if you'd like to make an online donation, you can go to sonomalandtrust.org/donate. So with that, let's check out some of these questions here. And one of the questions from Chris talks about the soil level receding, and I know that you did dig down. So 18,000 years ago, say, if there's a rub at 4 feet, would it be at 8 feet today? Or, how do you make that determination of where the soil level was back in this time?
So that's a really good question. And it's not the first time I've been asked that. And I hope this makes sense. What it appears to be, with the limited excavation I've done, mostly at that one site, the Jasper site, but I did do a small excavation at Sunset Rocks. And based on those two projects, it looks like soil has been building up more than going down or washing away. Now, that's marine terrace, depending on who you talk to, 1 or 5, but that marine terrace, I used to tell people it was 30 to 40,000 years old, where Sunset Rocks are. And in more recent geological work, people are saying it's probably more like 83,000 years old. So it's been accessible between uplift and ocean retreat. It's been accessible for a long time. Over time, undoubtedly, soil has built up and gone away. But in the last 18,000 years, based on the geomorphology we've done and excavating down, it appears to be a process of building up, except about 5,000 years ago. The middle Holocene seems to be missing in the soil profile. So something happened 5,000 or 6,000 years ago that got rid of a lot of the upper part of the soil, and then it started again. So at Jasper Rock, we found polish going 6 feet down below surface. Now that rock from the surface up is only another 6 feet, so 12 feet counting that. But at the Mammoth Rock site, we have polish going up 13 feet. I haven't excavated down more than about 50 centimeters, but the polish goes down. But what I have done at both sites is I've seen archaeology that quite possibly is pretty old, definitely Jasper Rock. We have evidence, well, we have firm evidence that people were there 9,000 years ago, sitting by those rocks. And we have suspicion that people were there quite a bit earlier. So combining the archaeology and the geology and the geomorphology, it appears that the soil is slowly building up and not being eliminated. But over the 80,000 years, the lower soils probably have come and gone. So I'm talking about the last 18,000 years. So it's a process of building up. And the 13 feet tall polish at Sunset Rocks may reflect polishing the last 10 or 15, 20,000 years. And as you go down, we might be seeing older, because we're talking about animals out there maybe for 60,000 years. And so that's a lot of time. So I don't know if that addresses the question. I hope it does, but it's a really good question.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I've got a question here from Lisette asking if there's contemporary animals, large mammals like pumas and mule deer, that coexisted with the Pleistocene fauna.
Absolutely. The cougar, elk, deer, the black bear, the California grizzly, the fox, the coyotes. Now, what the relationship and associations were 18,000 years ago probably look somewhat different than they do today. And I'll take the grizzly as an example. Native people in the ethnographic literature talk about a lot of grizzlies here. The early Spanish and gold miners that came in, they talk about a lot of grizzlies. And they were out on the Santa Rosa Plain and Petaluma Valley and Nicasio Valley. They were all down in the valleys. But you could probably run into one up in the hills also. I can't imagine there were that many California grizzlies out on the Farallon Plain or in the Petaluma Valley 18,000 years ago. I think the short-faced bears would have pretty much ruled that niche, which makes me think that the grizzlies were probably up in the woodlands and the hills, I think. The fossil record kind of suggests that, but I haven't seen enough of it. The problem with looking at the fossil record, so I showed that one chart of how many animals I thought were in the Bay Area 18,000 years ago, and I forgot to tell my point. My point was I figured one predator versus 140 large mega herbivores. So for every 140 bison or mammoth or wild horse or camel, you had one short-faced bear, grizzly bear, California American lion or whatever. So 140 herbivores to one predator. So if you find 50 fossil sites and each site has one animal, you're probably going to find 50 herbivore sites. You're not going to find a predator. So it's really rare to find predators. That said, we found them in the North Bay. They're here, but most of our numbers are bison and mammoth and mastodon. But based on what I've seen, though, I do think it's a good likelihood that the grizzlies were more in the hills, and as the short-faced bears became extinct, the grizzlies moved down, kind of like we're seeing with black bears. Historically, black bears had moved into areas that probably were grizzly habitat in the past, in the historic past. Animals do that. People do that also. People move into vacated areas and set up shop. And we're going to be seeing a lot more of that in the next couple of generations, unfortunately. As human migrations have to find new places to live. Animals have done the same thing over time. So the lions were here, the mountain lions, they were probably up in the mountains also, just like today. They're in the hills today partly because of human development. A mountain lion downtown Santa Rosa doesn't do too well. But at Sugarloaf or Hood Mountain or some of the open space land, they do great. So, yeah.
Well, we've got a question from Philip, which relates to that. You may have answered it, being that there's not many predator fossils around, but is there any signs of the cheetah around here?
The cheetah was in California, we think. I don't know that we have cheetah from this area. I'm trying to think where is the nearest, but quite possibly we would have had cheetah in the California Serengeti, whether it was, the Central Valley, there are cheetah finds on the other side of the Sierras I've read about. So if they're over there, we know California is a better place to be. I'm sure they were here. But finding a cheetah find, that would just be so rare. But, eventually someone will. It's much easier to find a bison. I worked in Petaluma. I had my office in Petaluma the last 15 years of my career until I retired. And within 1 mile of my office, I was aware of 3 fossil sites. A guy came in one day and said, I found this, I want to show it to you. And it was a fossil bison skull. He'd found a half mile from my office in a creek bed.
Wow.
I had another friend that said, I have a friend that just dug up a big bone, actually about 1.5 miles from my house, and it was a mammoth leg bone. And then the third one, my friend from Sonoma State, Rolf Erickson, the professor, told me about 1974. He got a call at Sonoma State. A rancher near my office, like a 1/4 mile from my office, had found some bones. And it turned out it was an immature bison calf, paleo, 12,000-year-old, 20,000-year-old bison skeleton intact, and a single mammoth tooth. And that's just within 1 mile, 1.5 miles of my office.
Wow.
If you look at the maps where fossils from Petaluma Valley are found, they're scattered all about, but they're mostly bison and mammoth and things like that. Very few predators.
We've got a question from Chris asking if Santa Rosa Junior College has mammoth fossils. Do they have some?
I don't know what they have there now, but back early in the history, Santa Rosa Junior College has been around for a long time. And early on in their history, the big bison latiferan, the one that's been extinct for 25,000 years, was found on campus there. And I know they used to have that. So if you read all the old, the reports written by paleontologists at Berkeley and the Academy of Science, they talk about this bison skull from Santa Rosa Junior College. So they had that one. But yeah, mammoth are pretty common in our area. Mastodon, not so much. I know of a couple of mastodon sites in Sonoma County, but I know of a lot of mammoth sites. I've heard of, a lot of mammoth sites.
Well, Lisette is referencing some work that Dan Jensen did in Costa Rica looking at neotropical fruits and their relationship to extinct gomphotires. And she's wondering if there's any analogous situation in this region. Did any plants in this region need to be consumed by Pleistocene megafauna in order to propagate?
Wow, that's a good one. I don't have a clue. I wish Steve Edwards was here, my friend Steve. He would be the guy that would have an idea about that. But that's a good question. You know what? I'll look into that. But I don't know the answer. That one stumps me.
That's fun. All right, so Richard Fuller's asking, one of your study areas was Central Siberia. Were you working in the Denisovin Cave, or did you get a chance to study the grizzlies in Kamchatka?
Actually, I would have loved to have done both of those. But I was escorting a group of local teenagers on a project I was doing for UNESCO. And when the internet first became available to us, I loved it. I didn't envision that tonight we would be talking to 119 people, 160 earlier, through my computer. We couldn't envision, but we all knew that the internet was going to do some wonderful things. I'm a fan of Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher, who coined the term global village. So back in the early 90s, I created a project called Fort Ross Global Village, and I ended up working with Alaskan, Siberian, or Russian, and California school teachers, and we brought kids online to study the history of Fort Ross in both Russia and the US. And one thing led to another, and I started going over early on with groups of kids that went over and spent the summer at Lake Baikal, living with Russian families. So that's how my work over there started. It's since progressed into several other things, including a little bit of archaeology, but mostly just, I don't know what you would call that, public service, statesmanship, but taking American kids who've never been out of the country to live with Russian families and getting them all home safe was probably one of my greatest achievements in life. Forget the archaeology and forget the publications and the documentaries. Just being able to do that meant so much to me. And still does.
Sure, that's something those kids will never forget.
And we still have friends. We all have friends over there. I've been back quite a few times. I've spent quite a bit of time in Russia over the years. and going back and forth. And I've had Russian friends here. Almost every day I hear from friends over there, including archaeologists. So yeah, so I'm working on a couple of writing projects right now with friends over there, but nothing archaeological, but I would love to work on some of those sites there someday. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So we've got a question here asking how far north that Farallon Plain, how far north the extent of it was, and also if you could just repeat how far west it went past the Farallon Islands. And relatedly, we saw that Google Earth image of the bathymetry of the ocean, and I was wondering, is there any evidence of the California River, spilling through the Golden Gate and heading out across the plain?
Yeah, it's the last 20 years, I've read everything I can, geology and paleontology and archaeology, and sometimes they all kind of get convoluted. But you have to do that to tell the story of the California Serengeti. In all those readings, I ran across several studies done by either NOAA or USGS where they cored off the California coast, right off the Golden Gate. And then they analyzed the sediments. And when you go through and find it, you see these deposits of Pleistocene, these Pleistocene deposits, sand and gravel deposits, which are at the mouth of what was the California River. So you can kind of see the California River that way. But if you look at a bathymetric image of San Francisco Bay, you can still see it. There's a channel there. And it comes down, out of Carquinez Straits. And it goes on the north side of Angel Island, what's now called Raccoon Strait, and it shoots straight through the Golden Gate. And you can see it outlined on San Francisco on the floor under all the sand. You can look through the sand and still see it. There's a bed there, and it's just phenomenal. And it's still funneling a lot of that water through the bay out to the Golden Gate. But if you were there 18,000 years ago, you would have to go further to where the bridge is. You'd have to go almost 30 miles in San Francisco, or actually 30 miles, because you had to go on the other side. You had to get to the western side of the Farallon Islands, the Cordell Banks, to have it drop off more than 400 feet. So how far north? When I look at a map, I just look at maps and say, well, that's it in my mind. Theoretically, you could go all the way, I guess, to Alaska, walking out there. But the large area, it kind of balloons out, is from Monterey Bay. In Monterey Bay, there's that deep canyon, the Monterey Canyon. So I start there and I go north all the way up to Fort Ross, Salt Point, and up somewhere around Gualala, it kind of starts shrinking again before it gets big again. So what I call the Farallon Plain is the area almost an equal distance north and south of the Farallon Islands out there. So San Francisco is more than 30 miles out to the end of it, but you get up to like Shell Beach in our area, and the water would have been about 12 miles further out. So it varies, depending on the shape of the land there. But when you add it all up, there's a couple million acres out there that I think would have been prime real estate for mega animals, prime pastures.
Mm-hmm. So we had a question from Bill. He's asking how many mammoth fossils have been found in Sonoma County, just to get a sense of how rare these are and who's looking for them and how hard is it to find one.
So I would say this. I would say many more have been found that we know about. So a lot of things get found and we never hear about. Things get found in construction sites and people are scared to say anything because they think it'll, mess up the plans. And maybe sometimes it does, but usually it doesn't. Usually it's just everybody, gets excited about it. But I can think of in the North Bay, probably 20 to 30 sites that are known where fossil mammoth have been found. There's mastodon, there's others, but just mammoth alone. And they're all over. I think mammoths are easier to find because like a mammoth leg bone is taller than I am, and I'm 6'4". So a mammoth leg bone's big. It's not finding a little fossil. So if you see a mammoth, you're probably not going to miss it. But I think more get found than we hear about. I've had people, probably 3 occasions in the last 10 years, friends of friends say, my friend has a ranch, so-and-so, and they found, a mammoth skeleton, and I'm trying to get them to let you come see it, but they're little, and, things like that. So I've heard about more than I've actually seen, but I've seen a few too. And there's a market, there's an illegal market, maybe in some cases legal, depending on whose land it is. So you have to be very careful talking about where mammoths are also. They sell for a lot of money, not as much as a T-Rex skeleton, which can sell for millions, but people pay a lot of money on the black market for a mammoth skeleton. So, we have to be careful about that also. But there are a lot of them in our area. I was talking to someone the other day. For all you know, when you go home tonight, your house may be built on top of a mammoth skeleton. It could be 8 feet down below the ground, but they're all through our area, because I figured in our North Bay, in the hundreds of thousands, actually 2 million years that mammoths were here, we probably had 4 million mammoths living in the North Bay over the history of their time. So 4 million mammoths. They're not all still surviving. Some floated out to sea, but there's probably so many, but they're just safely, deeply buried. And, it's kind of exciting. So everybody watch for them. And if you find a mammoth bone, the best thing to do is either call the Cal Academy of Science or call the University of California Museum of Paleontology in Berkeley. And they have recording systems, and they'll be excited to get it recorded. And it won't mean that you lose your property. If anything, it's just like a gold star. It'll make your property even more special. So,
what I'm doing this weekend, digging a hole.
Yeah. Put it in a backyard swimming pool, see what you find.
So you mentioned the ancient mammoth routes. So maybe Highway 1, 101 corridor, those types of things. Russian River might be the routes. Do we have any sense of how far or what the migration seasonal changes might have been for these animals? Did they move hundreds of miles each year? And was there a winter summer big difference during this ice age?
There should have been a noticeable difference between middle winter. Not as much as, say, in Siberia on the Siberian steppes, and not as much in Dakotas or other places where we had mammoths. California was a refugium, so because of the coastal currents and the Mediterranean climate, it wasn't as brutal as it was just 200 miles inland, and that affected things. It was also a different landscape. It was configured differently, and there was a reason to migrate, but it wasn't necessarily necessary to go a long distance. So if you think about our area, if you're going to migrate because of plants, you're going to go east or west. You're not necessarily going to go north or south. Now, if you want to get up into Sitka spruces, you've got to go 1,000 miles, 100 miles, hundreds of miles. But for the mammoth, for grasses and sedges, you just go east to west. And it's just a matter of going from the Central Valley around Sacramento or Petaluma Valley, Santa Rosa Plain, out to the coastal terraces. And that's the difference in foggy summers and not. And the fact that you had foggy summers on the coast meant that you still had really tasty, lush grasses, the grays, which were beginning to dry up a little bit and get not as palatable on the interior. And that would have been the reason for migration. But animals, so a mammoth, a 16 to 20,000 pound mammoth that's eating 500 to 700 pounds of food a day, and there's 7 to 20 in a herd, you can't stay stationary too long. You wipe out, you've got to keep moving. And I think it's a natural tendency looking at African elephants and some of the other animals that still migrate, and it's getting harder for animals to migrate. We're putting up a lot of hurdles. But if you imagine a perfect world and migration, even an area like ours that had lots of feed and a lot of acreage and beautiful pastures, they still had to move or they would spoil where they were standing. You couldn't have stationary mammoths for very long anymore than you can have stationary elephants, unless you put them in the zoo, And I don't want to do that. So, yeah.
You don't want to stay still, especially with those short-faced bears out there. Got to keep moving.
Yeah.
So we got time.
I just can't imagine.
Got time for about 2 more questions. This one's from Don. He notes that he's been kayaking out at Drake's Estero on Point Reyes, and he's come across what appears to be prehistoric fossils, possibly mammoths. And he's asking if you know anything about this near the mouth of Drake's Estero.
There's a site nearby where a farmer in the 1920s found a handful of bison teeth and a bison, the core of a horn, and a mammoth tooth, all in like a little eddy in the stream that was under soil. And so that's the one out there I'm aware of. There's several other there was one recently discovered out there not too far away that was in the paper, a mammoth tooth on the beach out there, just a couple miles north. But where he's kayaking should be a really hot area for mammoth and a lot of fossils. So what I would suggest he do, if he's willing, if next time if he can take a photograph of what he's seeing and send it to you, and you can send it to me, or he can find me online pretty easy also. I'd love to look at it. And if it's something important, I can help him find the right people to report it to if he wants to get it documented. And the more we document, the more we know, and the better stories I can tell. So I'd love to tell that story. So
yeah,
quite possibly it's a mammoth. Mammoth bones, though, again, are big. So if it's something really big, but it could be a lot of other fossil animals that he's seeing out there. But that's one of the hottest areas, I think, in my Serengeti plain model, is where he's kayaking. That's one of the most beautiful areas when you reconstruct the environment 18,000 years ago. That's where I would have been, if I was a mammoth.
I was just out there last week hiking the beach, and it's just an extraordinarily beautiful place. So yeah, get out there and see it. And so we'll finish with a question from Barry. He wants to see the rubbing rocks on the coast. Where does he park, and then where does he go?
What I would do, I would park at Shell Beach, at Sonoma Coast State Park. Park at Shell Beach and walk the Cordum Trail north 2 miles. It's a beautiful walk. It's flat, it's lovely. You'll see all types of beautiful, you'll see bunch grasses and sedges, and you'll hear a lot of birds. And if you're lucky, you'll see a whale. And in the distance, you'll see these 2 big rocks. And the really big one that looks like Shiprock, New Mexico, isn't it. You keep going, and you'll see the broken one that looks like a beautiful cathedral, about 60 feet tall spires. And you'll probably see people climbing it. That's Sunset Rock. There's always climbers there. And go to that one and walk around the rock, and you'll see it. And think about, if you're a mammoth, where could you get up to the rock and rub your back? And if you go to those spots, you'll find the polish. And it's worth a trip. And it's worth a trip not only to see the polish and the rocks, but just the experience, And as you walk the Cordum Trail, think about what it was like, 18,000 years ago. And thank God there's not any short-faced bears out there.
Amen to that. Well, Breck, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing all that amazing information and wisdom, and just to bringing us back in time to that amazing period when there was the California Serengeti right in our backyard. And
thank you. I enjoyed this, and I appreciate the Sonoma Land Trust. I know everybody in the audience does, so keep up the good work, and happy to be associated with you this way.
All right, and for all you participants out there, thanks so much for joining us. And again, check our website if you would like to see this again, or share it with your friends. So with that, have a great evening, and thanks for joining us.